So now we're ready to bind our quilt top, our quilt sandwich, our quilt, whatever you want to call it. But before we do that, we have to make our binding. Yes, you can go to the store. Any of your box stores will have blanket binding. You can definitely use that. I like to use the fabric that I use with my quilt, and so I make my own binding. And I typically use a 2.5 inch binding. I feel that that's a good size. You can definitely make it smaller. You can definitely make it bigger. It's whatever you choose for your quilt project. Hello and welcome. My name is Jackie with Jackie Russell Creates, where I give you tips, tricks, and techniques for your next sewing project. So if you would like to hit that subscribe button, and let's get started making this binding so we can finish up this quilt. So what I do for my binding is I go to that wonderful quilter's calculator, and I'm able to put in the width of my fabric, which typically is 43, and you put in how wide of a binding you want, and then you put in your quilt measurements, and it will tell you how many strips you need to cut. So there's two types of binding. You have a regular binding, and that's what I'm doing today, and that is where you cut going with the width of your fabric. The other is bias binding, and that's where you go on a 45. So I need 4 strips to finish up the quilt that I am currently doing. Once I get my strips, I'm going to piece them together, and I like to do that at a 45. So all you do is take your strips, you line them up with right sides together. You're going to fold over, and I'm just going to press, finger press. That's going to give me a crease right there. You could draw a line if you wanted, but it's going to give you a crease, and I'm just going to sew right down on that crease that I made. Then I'm going to cut off the excess, but before I cut it off, I always make sure that I sewed it the right direction, making sure that it's going to fold out the way that it's supposed to fold out. Then I go and iron that seam open, and I like to do it open so then you have less bulk. And then I press the binding in half to make it easier to put onto the quilt. And then as you can see here, I like to roll it up, and that just keeps it nice and together as we're pinning it to the quilt. Okay, so here we have our binding, and here's the seam. Hopefully you can see it. I just pressed it open, and then I pressed wrong sides together, and you can see where the bulk is distributed and not all up if you did it end to end. Then you're going to, I always start at the bottom of my quilts, and I try to go roughly around the center. I'm going to leave a pretty good tail so then I can finish off, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch all the way, and then when you get to a corner, you're going to take your binding and you're going to stop and backstitch at that corner, leaving 1/4 inch away from the edge, and then you're going to fold up your binding into a 45, and then you're going to fold it back down. That's how we're going to get that mitered corner. And you're going to fold it back down, and I like to pin, and then you're going to continue all the way down each side, doing the same way, stitching 1/4 inch to the corner, leaving 1/4 inch away, folding, starting at the end and going all the way down. So I'm going to add this first section of binding, and then I'll be back. Okay, I am on the last little section, and this is what I like to do. So I take the strip, the first strip that we started with, and I fold so the raw edges come down and it makes a little triangle. Then I stitch over to close it up. Pin that there. Then I like to take that end and also fold it down so raw edges are together, forming a little triangle. That just helps kind of give the continuous look of the 45. And I like to do it this way so I don't have to try to figure out how much to leave and do the 45 and cut it off. This just is really a simple way to get that same effect. Once I finish this, I'm going to take it to the ironing board and I'm going to press it, the binding open or out. So then it makes it so much easier when you go to fold it over and stitch it down all the way. And when you get to a corner, I open it up and I press that miter corner open. So, you know, it's this side, you know, press this way with this side so you have that crisp miter corner. So you're probably going to have little strips of binding left. Don't throw these away. I like to keep them for when I'm doing a scrappy binding, and I will just continue to add on to it, and eventually I'll have enough binding to do a scrappy binding on a quilt. So, you know, don't throw these away. I just save them and put them in a little basket until I'm ready to make a scrappy binding. So now you have it ironed. You're just going to roll it over and wonder clip it all the way around. And then you're just going to stitch. Now, you can hand stitch this down. You can machine stitch it. That's what I do. You can use a decorative stitch. You can do stitch in the ditch. It's whatever your preference is. But I also want to state that this is the way I do it. This is the way I was taught. There are many ways out there. It is finding what works best for you and your project. Other people will teach you to do it different. I sew my binding on the front and flip to the back. Some people sew it on the back and flip it to the front and stitch it down. There's so many ways. There's really not a set rule. Now, if you're doing a quilt for a show, then yes, there's going to be different per se standards. Like if you're submitting it into to be judged. But my quilts are all to be used. I don't submit them into quilt shows or the fair or anything like that. I want my quilts to be used. So, like I said, this is how I do it. Each quilt will be different depending on what I'm, going for. So for this one, I'm going to stitch right along that edge. Kind of like in the ditch, but real close to it. All the way around. And then your binding is done. That's all it is. This step of the binding, you can go all the way around without stopping. Like I said, you could do a decorative stitch if you want. I've done leaves, zigzags, So just play around with it and have fun and make each quilt unique. If you like this video and you like the quilt, there will be a playlist for coming up on screen. There is also going to be another playlist coming up on screen with tips, more tips and tricks. And until then, happy quilting, my friends.